Welcome to Think Like a Disciplinarian, enhancing rigor through critical thinking from a content perspective. As I go through the presentation, feel free to grab your notes, to pause the video, to grab your response sheet and record ideas, thoughts, and questions so that you're prepared to share with your group. Let's go ahead and get started. So, what is a disciplinarian? According to Dr. Sandra Kaplan, she's the lead gifted learning professor in the education department at USC. She uses this term to broadly mean just an expert in a particular field of study. It's a person who can teach, conduct research, and publish findings within a content area. It would be an expert in applying a discipline, so they could perform specialized tasks rather than just conduct basic research. Now that we've defined what a disciplinarian is, why think like a disciplinarian as a method for differentiation? Well, first, if it engages and stretches students. It presents subject matter in a more deeper way for students to analyze rather than just memorize facts. It provides a deeper reason and relevance for learning the material, acts as an anchor, leveraging material together. It allows students to gain familiarity with academic disciplines and academic language from different points of view and different perspectives. It demonstrates connections for students through the concepts they're learning between thinking processes that they're using and certain methodologies or strategies that they're using across the disciplines. So some knowledge of depth and complexity is necessary if you're going to use TLAD, that's Think Like a Disciplinarian for short, with your students. And one of the other modules that you are going to learn from your colleagues, they are going to go over depth and complexity in detail. And it is in the slide if you want to reference, it is in the depth and complexity module slides if you want to reference it in more detail. But your students do need to have an initial background and use of depth and complexity in order to really tap into the benefits of using Think Like a Disciplinarian. So I just wanted to throw that in there for you so you know. So how would you actually use thinking like a disciplinarian in your classroom? You'd start by creating kind of a simple frame within a single discipline for students to dive into. So you would obviously want to start with your content area standards to kind of think about what disciplinarian would most lend itself well. So let's take a look if you were a sixth grade teacher teaching a unit in life science. You particularly had this standard you were going to be exploring, the number and types of organisms an ecosystem can support depends on the resources available and on abiotic factors. So you'd have to think about what disciplinarian might work well with this standard first. And I provided a list for you within your packet of many different disciplinarians that you could reference. So please reference that if you want to at this point. Step 2 would be to layer these thinking tools or prompts, the elements of depth and complexity that you can see here in the middle, to help create questions and prompts so that students can either individually or within teams use to dive deeper into the curriculum. So let's take a look here. We would take our objective, the number of types of organisms an ecosystem can support depends on the resources available and on abiotic factors. We would take that lesson standard through the lens of an ecologist. Students would learn what an ecologist is first, a person who studies the relations and interactions between organisms and their environment, including other organisms. They could use these tools here to help anchor themselves to questions. What ethical issues might an ecologist investigate when studying ecosystems? So they would use the icon of ethics to help them look from the perspective of an ecologist. They would use patterns to help them answer the question, what patterns might an ecologist examine? They could use the language of the discipline icon, this one here, to help investigate important words that we would need to understand ecosystems. And finally, they could discuss the details with this icon here that an ecologist might examine when studying an ecosystem's ability to support life. And you could create a task for students that would utilize these questions from the perspective of an ecologist studying organisms and ecosystems. Here's what the frame might end up looking like. So in the middle of the frame, they would put thinking like an ecologist. You could even have them write out the standard and kid-friendly language below, giving some specificity to the task. And here along the quadrants, you would go ahead and put whatever thinking prompts or tools you feel lend itself well to the study, and whatever prompt or question you would use to get kids to dive in deeper. And they could do this independently. They could use resources, the internet. For example, if they have online access, they could use websites you've provided. You could provide paper copies of texts for them to read. You could actually bring in artifacts for them to look at and examine. So you could use the frame to teach, to introduce the disciplinarian. You could introduce thinking tools used in the frame as well. You would then present the questions on a disciplinarian frame. Students can work in groups, pairs, or as individuals. They could share out and reflect as to how thinking like this disciplinarian enhanced their understanding of whatever specific content. And this could mushroom in many, many different ways. It could lead students then to an individual projects related to that particular content standard. It could mushroom into different disciplinarians that link to the original. The sky's really the limit. Let's take a look at another example here of thinking like a geologist. I'll give you a few minutes to take a look at this screen. If I was doing this for the first time, I would have to introduce thinking tools within a frame of reference. And so if you're working with a team of other teachers or teachers from a past grade level, you could see if kids were familiar with already using these depth and complexity icons, but you would have to introduce the icons first in some kind of familiar manner with a topic that they're familiar with. I teach junior hires. They're always on their cell phones. I could pick this as a topic to simply introduce the meaning behind these visual prompts. Let's take a look at how we could apply this to science. Thinking like a geologist and studying some element of soil, for example. I'll give you a second to read it over and look at some of the questions created for this frame. Let's move to another example, social studies. Thinking like a historian about the decline of the feudal lifestyle. I could have done pre-research on the feudal lifestyle or a direct instruction lesson. My students could be at the point where they need to go deeper with this. And so we could begin to analyze from different thinking levels from the perspective and lens of a historian. I'll give you a few seconds to peruse this frame before we move to the next one. And again, using a language arts model, the book The Outsiders, but thinking like a psychologist and looking at the rules and multiple perspectives of relationships, how characters view their own behavior, the ethical dilemmas within the book, and of course, patterns amongst characters' behaviors. Here's one for math, where students would think like a statistician. What is the big idea the creator of this graph, let's say, is trying to communicate? Do any potential ethical issues arise from the presentation of this data? From whose perspective is this data given? What unanswered questions arise from these graphs? Creating the frame across disciplines, aligning the content standards with disciplinarians. You can see here in a unit on wildfires, for example. A student sample of what this might look like on a poster board. We're going to look at many examples, even using a differentiated word wall to develop deeper learning about a discipline. You could even use TLAD with technology. You could use Google Docs to help frame. The sky is really the limit here.